Famous Greek tale, some of you heard it or not, and there's different iterations of it around about. But this Greek tale is about a fellow named Democles. Now, Democles, he envied the power, the wealth, the privilege of Dionysius II, the ruler of Syracuse. And it kind of became known. And so one day, Democles was praying at the altar of the gods, and he made an oath. And he said, if I ever get a chance to live like a king, I will never regret it. I would treasure such a life forever and do nothing to jeopardize it. Now, King Dionysius found out about Democles' prayer and his wish, and he decided to grant it. So since he swore to the gods and he made an oath, he figured out he could hold Democles to it. Democles could enjoy the life of the palace and all the luxuries every single day. The only catch was, from light till dark, he had to sit in the throne. And all day long, an exceedingly sharp and heavy sword will be suspended over that throne by a horsehair. A single horsehair. Now, needless to say, Democles enjoyed the palace life for a very short time. He could not take the daily pressure and the stress of impending death hanging over him that most rulers actually endure every day. So, in the end, his oath was quite foolish. Now, at the beginning of our weekly reading, there's a passage that always seems to upset people. At least I found that it does, because people have always asked me questions about it. As people read this, they just kind of scratch their heads and says, what was this? And especially it upsets women. I don't know, maybe you know the passage I'm talking about. It's right there in the beginning of the Parsha. In Numbers chapter 30, verse 4, it says, Veisha ki tidor neget l'Adonai. If a woman swears an oath to Adonai. And without even going into the details of what that sort of an obligation or the oath may be, the Torah does not go into that at all. Moses just explains that this oath is binding only if and unless her father finds out and he says it's not. Or husband maybe as well. So Moses explains that basically her oath can be nullified. Her promise can be made void. A father can annul, literally, a daughter's oath. Now, in verse 6, also Hashem explains through Moses, the Torah says, Lo yakum. The obligations will not stand. It literally says, it will not stand. And then then Moshe adds and says, V'Adonai yislach la. And Hashem will forgive her. Literally, he will forgive her. Because, well, the father annulled her obligation. She's no longer obligated to whatever promises that came out of her lips. Now, that is quite the veto power, right? Torah gives the father a veto power. Now, to make things worse, the same basic principle that we encounter here of binding versus non-binding, valid versus invalid oaths applies to a wife and also to a widow. The Torah goes in to explain that there's other implications of this commandment, basically. So a vow is valid unless it is invalidated by a husband or a father. And reading this on the surface, of course, most people would read this and they would say, well, a woman's promise can be nullified by a man. And of course, in our gender-focused society, everything is a man against woman, and that's how people look at it. And without an expressed objection, if a woman makes a promise before God, before his holy altar, apparently, according to Hashem, it is binding and it stands, but unless there is an objection. So the question, of course, I have, and many people that have asked, is why does the Torah give fathers and husbands such a power over promises that their daughters and wives make? Right? It's unfair. Seems not right. Are they lesser people? Are women not capable of making good promises? Are they prone to overpromise? And of course, the answer to all these questions is no. That's not it. Women are just as capable of making good and reasonable and fitting oaths and taking on meaningful promises and obligations as men are. That's nonsense. So why does the Torah give fathers and husbands such veto rights over promises that they make. And so the explanation is actually quite simple, and it evades us because we do not live in the world in which this promise was made. In the ancient world, people's means, their livelihood, were tied up with their families. Vows often carried monetary and very tangible obligations. And women did not manage household resources in that world, and thus could not make unilateral decisions of this type of nature. And making such commitments in the ancient Near East simply did not work that way. So it's like this. Imagine that without me knowing what bills need to be paid soon by you and your family, you just hand me your ATM card, or in the ancient days, a checkbook, and let me loose. And let me just shop until I drop buying whatever it is I want until the money there runs out. No, credit cards won't work in this case. It's got to be something that actually runs out. And so I don't know what bills you have to pay, but I'm just going to go and spend all that money, right? And I'm going to obligate you then to still pay those bills that are coming. So you see the point. This is kind of like what is happening in this passage. At that time, in that era, the fathers and husbands, they had veto to protect the daughters and wives from vows that they be making that might obligate them to things they don't even really fully realize the family may not even have the resources to fulfill. Those resources might have already been committed to something else. And so the vows and promises, they're quite serious in the Torah. Invalid oaths actually are unrighteous. They're sinful. That's what Torah tells us. So what wisdom can we learn and take away today from such a seemingly chauvinistic commandment? I have a couple of thoughts for you. I might take you in a slightly better direction than most people run with. First point is this. All of us, men, women, children, parents, we all should not make promises that we cannot keep. I think that one goes without saying. It's an obvious point from this text. Now, how do we know which promises we can keep and which promises we cannot keep? The answer is, we don't. We really don't. Most things in life are not under our absolute control. In fact, nothing in life is under our absolute control. Yeshua taught us not to make oaths and vows as a general practice because we do not control the life that we live. If we think we have control, it's an illusion. We don't even control if our hair falls out or not. Basically, we really don't have that much control. We don't know these things. So making promises, we're assuming that we can keep them, but we don't always come to that point. And that's why the Jewish tradition, maybe you've heard this, when people are promising something, they would say, bli neder, meaning, I'm not swearing, no oath. I am going to meet you tomorrow, but this is not an oath. I'm not swearing. Or people would say sometimes, Lord willing, such and such will happen, or Lord willing, I will do this and that. And that's a much safer way to make a promise, recognizing that you are not fully in control of everything that might or might not happen. So that's point number one. Point number two is being released from an oath or an obligation that one cannot keep. My friends, is a blessing. People read this passage in a very negative sense, that, oh, there's this veto power. But if the oath you're making is no good, being released from it actually is a wonderful thing. Some people make bargains with God. Maybe you've heard this. People say, Lord, if you do this, I will do that. Maybe you've done that at some point in your life. I don't know. Well, guess what? That's an oath. That's an obligation. And those things end up being broken. Not always. Sometimes they work out. Remember Hannah and her prayer as she prayed before Hashem, before the altar, and she made a promise, and God gave her exactly what she was asking for, and then she gave up her son. That's the story of Samuel, right? Sometimes things work out, but it's up to us to do the right thing when God actually fulfills his part. And God expects us to keep those promises, to keep our commitments. And that's the biggest part with us and oaths. We don't always keep them. So when we read this passage, it's not that women cannot make valid oaths or vows. It's just that they have a special blessing in their lives. And that is someone who can release them from promises that they're unable to keep, that they may be making without enough wisdom of the situation. Look at it in a positive way. There's someone out there who's got your back and will basically not allow you to make a promise for which you will not be able to keep. Oaths are like contracts. They're like court sentences sometimes. And in the end, if not kept, it's a sin. And God judges them. So on Yom Kippur, we stand before Hashem and we chant this prayer called Kol Nidrei, right? What is this all about? We're asking Hashem to release us from the promises, from the oaths, from obligations, from things that we might have said that we did not mean, or in foolishness, or even under compulsion or duress, or will say. Exactly. All the oaths that we will yet make, says the words of prayer, in the future. We're asking for a release. You see, sometimes we are like the Damocles gentleman in my story that I told you about. We're swearing things, we want something, we do not even know what it is that we want for sure. When we get it, we're not sure that that's what we actually wanted. After all, for many of us, I want you to think for a second, Yeshua, our master, he is like a father. And by his merit, we are released from unrighteousness, from unwise bargains, from promises, from short-sighted oaths, from foolish obligations that we have made. So don't look down on this veto power, but recognize that that is Hashem giving us mercy and blessing.